March 18, 1945. The Outgunned Forest. In a clearing that had been mapped by German artillery observers with surgical precision, 237 American soldiers faced the kind of tactical nightmare that transforms brave men into statistics and military careers into cautionary tales. Major David Coleman stood among pine trees that had been shattered by weeks of artillery fire, studying a situation that defied every solution taught at West Point and demanded choices that no officer wanted to make. The encirclement had developed with the methodical efficiency that characterized German defensive operations in the war's final months. Coleman's battalion had advanced through forest paths that seemed clear of enemy resistance, following intelligence reports that indicated German withdrawal from positions they had held for 6 months. But the intelligence had been wrong, catastrophically, deliberately wrong. And now American forces found themselves trapped in a pocket that German planners had designed specifically to destroy entire units through systematic annihilation. 3 directions blocked by machine gun nests positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. The 4th direction sealed by artillery batteries that could deliver concentrated barrages within 60 seconds of any movement toward what appeared to be escape routes. German forces had turned the forest clearing into an outdoor execution chamber where American soldiers could be eliminated at leisure, without risk to defending units that held every tactical advantage. Coleman had tried everything conventional military doctrine suggested for breakout operations. Dawn attacks had been repelled with minimal German casualties, while costing him 37 men who died advancing toward positions they never had realistic chances of reaching. Attempts at infiltration during darkness had failed. When German listening posts detected movement and directed artillery fire that turned stealth operations into mass casualty events. Radio communications with divisional headquarters had been severed when German jammers overwhelmed American frequencies with static that made coordination impossible. Even if communications had been functional, reinforcement was unlikely. Intelligence reports indicated that German forces had committed significant reserves to maintaining the encirclement, understanding that destroying an entire American battalion would provide strategic advantages beyond simple casualty counts. The mathematics were unforgiving. Coleman commanded 237 men with ammunition for perhaps 12 hours of sustained combat. German forces surrounding them numbered at least 800, were well supplied with artillery support, and occupied positions that had been prepared for exactly this type of operation. Every tactical manual concluded that breakout attempts under these conditions produced casualty rates approaching 100%, while achieving strategic results approaching 0. But Major Coleman had been studying German defensive psychology with the intensity of someone whose life depended on understanding enemy decision-making processes. Throughout his 18 months of combat operations, he had observed patterns in German tactical responses that suggested something potentially exploitable, a rigidity in operational thinking that might create opportunities for unconventional solutions. German military doctrine emphasized thorough planning, systematic execution, and adherence to established procedures that had proven effective throughout years of successful operations. But doctrine could become a limitation when circumstances demanded responses that hadn't been anticipated by planners who assumed American forces would always behave according to predictable patterns. Coleman's radio operator, Sergeant Williams, looked up from equipment that could receive German communications but no longer transmitted American ones. "Sir, we're picking up enemy traffic. Sounds like they're planning final assault operations for 0600 tomorrow. They're discussing casualty estimates and prisoner processing procedures." The words carried implications that chilled everyone within hearing range. German forces weren't planning to accept surrender. They were planning systematic elimination of American forces who had become inconvenient to guard and expensive to maintain. The encirclement wasn't designed to capture prisoners. It was designed to eliminate witnesses to tactical methods that German commanders preferred to keep classified. Coleman studied maps that showed his position with depressing accuracy. His men occupied terrain that provided minimal defensive advantages against attackers who controlled all high ground and approach routes. Traditional defensive positions would delay the inevitable, but couldn't prevent it. Breakout attempts would achieve nothing accept faster casualties. Surrender might result in execution rather than prisoner status. But in Coleman's mind, a desperate idea was taking shape, something so fundamentally contrary to military training that his own men would question his sanity and his superiors would probably court-martial him if he survived to face charges. What if surrender wasn't the end of military options, but the beginning of a completely different kind of warfare? German forces expected American resistance to follow predictable patterns: defensive fighting followed by breakout attempts, followed by final surrender when ammunition was exhausted. They had prepared for all three phases with tactical efficiency that left no room for American success through conventional methods. But they hadn't prepared for surrender that wasn't actually surrender, for an American commander who understood that raising white flags might create opportunities that fighting to the death would never provide. Coleman was contemplating something that existed beyond military doctrine, using enemy expectations against them by doing exactly what they anticipated, but for reasons they could never suspect. What he was about to attempt would either be remembered as tactical genius or branded as the greatest betrayal in American military history. Major David Coleman hadn't reached his current rank through political connections or staff assignments. He had earned command through 18 months of combat operations that had taught him to think beyond the limitations of textbook tactics. A former high school teacher from Nebraska, Coleman possessed something that conventional military education couldn't provide: the ability to read human psychology with the precision of someone who had spent years managing adolescent behavior patterns. Teaching had prepared Coleman for military command in ways that West Point couldn't replicate. Classroom management required understanding how groups responded to authority, how individual psychology influenced collective behavior, and how apparent compliance could mask active resistance. More importantly, teaching had taught Coleman that sometimes the most effective leadership strategy was allowing people to believe they were controlling situations they actually weren't. Now, surrounded by German forces who held every tactical advantage, Coleman was about to apply educational psychology to military strategy in ways that would either save his battalion or destroy his reputation forever. The plan forming in his mind violated every principle of military honor that had been drilled into him during officer training, but it was based on careful observation of German operational patterns that suggested exploitable weaknesses in enemy thinking. Coleman had been studying intercepted German communications for weeks, analyzing the language and assumptions that revealed how enemy commanders approached tactical decision-making. German officers displayed remarkable competence in conventional operations, but they also showed rigid adherence to doctrinal procedures that could become limitations when circumstances demanded improvisation. German forces expected American resistance to follow predictable sequences: determined fighting, breakout attempts, final surrender when casualties became unsustainable. Their tactical planning was built around these assumptions, with resources allocated to counter each phase of expected American responses. But German planning hadn't considered the possibility that American surrender might be the beginning rather than the end of military operations. Coleman's executive officer, Captain Morrison, studied maps that showed their impossible position with growing appreciation for the complexity of what his commander was contemplating. Morrison had served with Coleman since North Africa and understood that the Major's tactical innovations often appeared insane until they produced results that conventional methods couldn't achieve. "Sir," Morrison said quietly, "what you're suggesting isn't just unconventional, it's potentially treasonous. If this goes wrong, court-martial proceedings will be the least of our problems. We could be executed as spies rather than treated as prisoners of war." Coleman nodded, understanding the risks better than anyone else in his command. Using false surrender as a tactical deception violated international conventions that protected all combatants, American and German alike. If enemy forces discovered the deception, they would be legally justified in treating Coleman's men as unlawful combatants, subject to immediate execution. But Coleman had calculated that German forces were already planning to eliminate his battalion, regardless of surrender status. Intercepted communications suggested that enemy commanders viewed American prisoners as logistical burdens who would be processed according to procedures that sounded suspiciously like euphemisms for systematic execution. "Morrison," Coleman said, spreading intelligence reports across a map that showed German positions with depressing detail. "They're going to kill us, whether we fight or surrender. The only question is whether we die accomplishing nothing, or whether we take advantage of their assumptions to accomplish something they'll never expect." The plan Coleman outlined challenged every assumption about how surrender was supposed to function in civilized warfare. Instead of ending hostilities, surrender would become the first phase of a psychological operation designed to exploit German expectations while creating opportunities for tactical surprise that conventional resistance could never provide. German forces anticipated that surrendering Americans would be demoralized, disorganized, and completely focused on personal survival rather than continued military objectives. Enemy guards would be relaxed around prisoners who posed no apparent threat, communication security would be minimal around defeated soldiers, and tactical information would be discussed freely in the presence of Americans who were presumably eliminated as military factors. But Coleman's surrender would be carefully orchestrated to gather intelligence about German positions, identify weaknesses in enemy security, and create opportunities for coordinated action when German forces least expected resistance from supposedly defeated Americans. It would be surrender as reconnaissance mission, capitulation as preparation for counterattack. The major called together his company commanders for a briefing that would either make military history or end their careers permanently. What he was about to propose required volunteers who understood that they were risking not just their lives, but their honor as American soldiers. They would be choosing a form of warfare that existed in gray areas between courage and deception, strategy and betrayal. "Gentlemen," Coleman began, "I'm going to ask you to do something that violates everything we've been taught about military honor, but I believe it's the only way to save our men and accomplish our mission. We're going to surrender to the Germans, and then we're going to use their assumptions about defeated soldiers to destroy them from within their own positions." The silence that followed was broken only by artillery fire from German positions that served as constant reminders of the tactical impossibility they faced through conventional methods. Coleman was asking his officers to trust him with something more valuable than their lives, their reputations as soldiers who had never abandoned their duty or betrayed their country's trust. What happened next would determine whether Coleman was a tactical genius or a man whose desperation had driven him beyond the boundaries of honorable conduct. 800 hours, March 19, 1945. The moment when Major Coleman would either vindicate tactical audacity or confirm suspicions that desperation had driven him beyond rational decision-making. Standing in a forest clearing that had become a killing ground, Coleman prepared to raise a white flag that would mean something completely different from what German observers would assume they were witnessing. The psychological preparation had taken most of the night. Coleman's company commanders had briefed their men on a mission that required acting skills nobody had trained for in basic training. Soldiers who had been taught to fight until death were now being asked to surrender convincingly while maintaining readiness for coordinated action that might come hours or days later, depending on opportunities that couldn't be predicted. Sergeant Williams, Coleman's radio operator, had rigged communication equipment to appear disabled while maintaining hidden capabilities that would enable coordination with any American forces that might attempt rescue operations. The deception required technical expertise and acting ability in equal measure. German inspectors had to believe they were examining destroyed equipment while missing functional components that could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. But the most critical element of Coleman's plan was psychological rather than technical. His men had to project the defeated attitude that German forces expected from surrendering Americans while maintaining unit cohesion and tactical awareness that would enable rapid response when opportunities developed. They had to become actors playing roles that felt like betrayal while preparing for actions that would justify the risks they were taking. At precisely 800 hours, Coleman stepped into the clearing and raised a white flag improvised from a torn undershirt. German machine gun fire immediately ceased, replaced by the kind of tactical silence that indicated professional soldiers confirming what they were observing before responding to unexpected developments. Through field glasses, German officers studied Coleman's gesture with the careful attention of men who understood that battlefield deceptions were always possible, but surrender seemed unlikely, under circumstances where American forces had shown no previous indication of considering capitulation. The Major's body language had to communicate genuine defeat while concealing tactical awareness that could expose the deception if German observers suspected anything unusual. Within 15 minutes, German officers approached under a flag of truce to negotiate surrender terms. Captain Klaus Weber, commanding the German forces that had maintained the encirclement, studied Coleman with the professional respect that experienced soldiers accorded worthy opponents, but also with suspicion that suggested Weber understood battlefield psychology well enough to question apparent American capitulation. "Major," Weber said in accented English, "your resistance has been admirable, but your situation is hopeless. Unconditional surrender is your only option for preventing complete annihilation of your command. My orders are to eliminate American forces in this sector, but prisoner status might be possible if your men comply completely with German requirements." Coleman's response required balancing realism with deception. He had to sound like a defeated officer genuinely concerned for his men's welfare, while avoiding language that might suggest hidden agendas or tactical preparations. Every word would be analyzed by German intelligence officers who understood that American commanders sometimes attempted deceptions even under impossible circumstances. "Captain Weber," Coleman replied, "my men have fought well, but continued resistance serves no purpose except additional casualties. We surrender unconditionally, with the understanding that my soldiers will be treated according to international conventions governing prisoner status." The formal surrender ceremony that followed had to satisfy German requirements for documentation while enabling Coleman's men to maintain subtle communication and coordination capabilities. Weapons were surrendered with the theatrical reluctance that German forces expected, but personal equipment was retained according to patterns that would enable coordinated action if opportunities developed. German security measures were thorough but not paranoid. Weber's forces had successfully contained and defeated numerous American units, and their procedures reflected confidence born from experience, with legitimate surrenders. American prisoners were searched for weapons and dangerous equipment, but personal items were generally ignored unless they appeared to have obvious military significance. Coleman's men were processed with efficient professionalism that revealed both German competence and potential vulnerabilities. Guards were alert, but not hyper-vigilant around prisoners, who showed appropriate demoralization. Communication among guards was conducted in German that many Americans understood, but weren't expected to comprehend. Most importantly, German forces began relaxing tactical security measures around soldiers who were no longer considered active threats. But the most valuable intelligence came from observing German positions and procedures that had been invisible from American lines. Coleman's men were marched through defensive networks that revealed the true extent of enemy fortifications, ammunition storage, locations, communication centers, and command bunkers that aerial reconnaissance had never detected. By evening, 237 defeated American soldiers were housed in a temporary prisoner compound that provided perfect observation of German tactical operations. Enemy forces continued normal activities around prisoners who were assumed to be completely eliminated as military factors, discussing operational plans and security measures with the casual openness that characterized soldiers who believed their conversations couldn't possibly compromise their missions. Coleman's gamble was working beyond his most optimistic expectations. German forces were providing detailed intelligence about their own operations to prisoners who remained secretly committed to exploiting every piece of information for tactical advantage. The surrender that appeared to end American resistance was actually enabling reconnaissance that conventional methods could never have achieved. But Coleman understood that the most dangerous phase was just beginning. His men were now behind German lines with perfect knowledge of enemy dispositions, but converting intelligence into action would require timing, coordination, and luck that couldn't be controlled through planning alone. The defeated American battalion was about to discover whether surrender could become the foundation for the most audacious reversal in military history. March 21, 1945. 0200 hours. 48 hours after surrendering to German forces, Major Coleman's men had transformed from defeated prisoners into the most well-informed intelligence-gathering operation in the European theatre. Living within German defensive positions while maintaining the appearance of demoralized captives, 237 American soldiers possessed detailed knowledge of enemy capabilities that no conventional reconnaissance could have provided. The intelligence Coleman's prisoners had gathered was extraordinary in its scope and tactical value. German defensive positions that had appeared impregnable from American lines revealed structural weaknesses that could be exploited by coordinated attacks. Ammunition storage facilities were located in positions vulnerable to sabotage operations. Communication centers operated on schedules that created windows of opportunity for disruption. Most importantly, German forces had reduced security measures around installations they assumed were protected by the presence of American prisoners. But information was worthless without the ability to act on it, and Coleman faced challenges that no military manual had ever addressed. His men were confined within a German-controlled compound, surrounded by guards who would shoot escapees without hesitation, and completely cut off from American forces who believed the entire battalion had been eliminated during the encirclement operation. Coleman's solution required converting apparent captivity into tactical advantage through psychological manipulation that would make German guards unwitting accomplices in their own destruction. The major had been studying guard routines and security procedures with the attention of someone whose life depended on understanding how German soldiers balanced efficiency with human nature. German guards were professional soldiers who took their duties seriously, but they were also human beings who had been fighting for months without rest, adequate food, or reasonable hope of surviving the war. They responded to prisoner compliance with reduced vigilance, appreciated American soldiers who caused no trouble, and gradually developed the casual attitudes that made effective security impossible to maintain indefinitely. Sergeant Williams had identified crucial vulnerabilities in German communication security by observing radio procedures from positions where prisoners could overhear conversations never intended for enemy analysis. German operators discussed tactical information with casual openness around Americans who were assumed to be permanently eliminated as intelligence threats. Captain Morrison had mapped German defensive positions by carefully observing guard rotations, supply movements, and tactical preparations that revealed the true structure of enemy fortifications. Information gathered from prisoner status was more complete than any aerial photography or conventional reconnaissance could have provided. But the most valuable discovery came from understanding German assumptions about American prisoner psychology. Enemy guards expected defeated soldiers to be focused exclusively on personal survival, completely demoralized by captivity, and utterly uninterested in military activities that were no longer their responsibility. These assumptions created security gaps that Coleman's men could exploit for purposes German forces would never anticipate. On the night of March 21st, Coleman implemented the second phase of his deception with timing that depended on German routines his men had studied for 48 hours. At precisely 0200 hours, when guard changes created brief gaps in surveillance, selected American prisoners began moving through German positions with objectives that would either vindicate Coleman's strategy or result in immediate execution for all participants. The operation required coordinated actions by men who had to maintain prisoner status while conducting military operations behind enemy lines. Teams moved through German positions to cut communication lines, destroy ammunition supplies, and eliminate sentries with silent efficiency that professional soldiers respect, regardless of uniform colors. German forces discovered the scope of American deception when communication failures prevented coordination of defensive responses to attacks that seemed to materialize from impossible directions. Guards who had been providing security for prisoner compounds found themselves under attack by soldiers they had assumed were completely defeated and permanently eliminated as military threats. But Coleman's master stroke was psychological rather than tactical. German defenders faced the terrifying realization that their prisoners had been observing, analyzing, and planning from within German positions for days while maintaining the appearance of defeated soldiers. The enemy's greatest defensive advantage, detailed knowledge of American capabilities, had been turned against them by Americans who possessed even more complete information about German weaknesses. The battle that followed lasted less than 3 hours, but challenged every assumption German forces held about conventional warfare and prisoner psychology. American soldiers who had supposedly surrendered fought with coordination that indicated extensive preparation and intelligence that could only have been gathered from within German positions. German resistance collapsed when defending units realized they were fighting Americans who knew German defensive plans better than many German soldiers did. Units that had successfully contained American forces for months found themselves outmaneuvered by enemies who had studied their routines, identified their weaknesses, and planned attacks with intelligence that conventional reconnaissance could never have provided. By dawn, German forces were retreating from positions they had held for 6 months, abandoning equipment and supplies to American soldiers who had achieved victory through methods that violated every assumption about how modern warfare was supposed to function. Coleman's surrender had become the foundation for tactical success that conventional military operations could never have achieved, proving that sometimes defeat could become victory when commanders were willing to think beyond traditional concepts of honorable conduct. The aftermath of Coleman's surrender victory would send shockwaves through military institutions on both sides of the Atlantic, forcing a complete re-evaluation of prisoner protocols, battlefield ethics, and the boundaries between legitimate tactical deception and violations of international warfare conventions. What had begun as one major's desperate attempt to save his battalion became a case study that challenged fundamental assumptions about honor, duty, and acceptable conduct in civilized warfare. Within hours of the German retreat, field commanders throughout the European theater were demanding detailed reports about how 237 defeated American prisoners had transformed captivity into the most successful intelligence operation of the war. Radio traffic buzzed with requests for clarification about methods that seemed to violate everything military professionals understood about surrender protocols and prisoner psychology. General Patton himself arrived at Coleman's position within 24 hours, not to congratulate the major, but to determine whether court-martial proceedings were necessary for violations of military honor that might compromise American credibility in future prisoner exchanges. Patton was a soldier who valued results over regulations, but even he understood that some tactical innovations could undermine the entire foundation of civilized warfare. "Coleman," Patton said, after reviewing detailed reports of the operation, "what you accomplished was either the most brilliant tactical innovation I've seen in this war, or the most dangerous precedent any American officer has ever established. You saved your men and achieved strategic objectives that conventional methods couldn't have touched. But you also did something that could get American prisoners executed if German forces decide that surrender can't be trusted anymore." Coleman's response revealed the moral complexity that would haunt military ethicists for decades. "Sir, German forces were already planning to execute my men regardless of prisoner status. Intelligence intercepts confirmed that surrender would have meant systematic elimination disguised as prisoner processing. Under those circumstances, conventional surrender protocols became suicide pacts rather than protections under international law." The major had documented German intentions with intercepted communications that painted a chilling picture of enemy plans for American prisoners. Rather than following Geneva Convention requirements for prisoner treatment, German forces had been implementing systematic elimination procedures that used legitimate administrative language to conceal war crimes. But Coleman's justification raised questions that extended beyond immediate tactical concerns. If enemy forces violated international conventions, did that release American soldiers from their own obligations under those same conventions? Could tactical necessity justify methods that undermined the entire framework of civilized warfare? Where was the line between legitimate military innovation and dangerous precedent that could escalate conflict beyond controllable boundaries? Intelligence officials who debriefed Coleman's men discovered that the operation had produced strategic intelligence far beyond anything conventional reconnaissance could have achieved. German defensive plans, troop strengths, supply routes, and communication procedures had been mapped with precision that would enable future operations to succeed where previous attempts had failed for months. But the broader implications concerned military planners who understood that tactical innovations could become strategic liabilities if they encouraged similar responses from enemy forces. If American officers could use false surrender as a tactical deception, German commanders might conclude that legitimate American surrenders were potentially deceptive and respond with immediate execution rather than prisoner processing. The moral questions became even more complex when German survivors were interviewed about their experiences during Coleman's operation. Many German soldiers expressed admiration for American tactical audacity, while simultaneously arguing that such methods made future cooperation between opposing forces virtually impossible. Professional soldiers could respect tactical brilliance while recognizing that some innovations threatened the foundations of their profession. International law specialists spent months analyzing Coleman's actions to determine whether existing conventions adequately addressed situations where enemy forces had already abandoned their obligations under international agreements. The Major's defense that conventional surrender would have resulted in systematic execution was supported by intercepted German communications, but it established precedents that could justify almost any tactical deception under appropriate circumstances. Coleman was ultimately awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for tactical innovation that saved American lives and achieved strategic objectives through methods that conventional military doctrine had never considered. But the citation carefully avoided endorsing his methods as examples for future operations, acknowledging tactical success while maintaining institutional commitment to established protocols. The veterans of Coleman's battalion would remember March 1945 as the time when surrender became victory through moral courage that couldn't be found in any regulation or field manual. Their major had proven that military effectiveness sometimes required abandoning traditional concepts of honor in favor of deeper commitments to soldier welfare and mission accomplishment. Modern military doctrine now includes classified annexes addressing tactical deceptions that exist in gray areas between legitimate innovation and dangerous precedent. Coleman's surrender gambit had forced recognition that warfare sometimes demanded choices between competing moral obligations, with no perfect solutions available to commanders who faced impossible situations. But perhaps the most profound legacy of Coleman's victory was its demonstration that honor could take forms that traditional military culture didn't recognize, that courage sometimes required violating sacred principles in service of deeper truths, and that the greatest tactical innovations emerged from willingness to think beyond institutional limitations when conventional methods guaranteed failure. Today, when military academies teach leadership to officers who will face moral complexity that no classroom can fully prepare them for, Coleman's surrender victory serves as a reminder that effectiveness and honor are not always synonymous, that tactical success may require ethical choices that challenge comfortable assumptions, and that sometimes the greatest service to military values requires violating military traditions. In the end, Coleman had proven that victory and defeat were not always determined by conventional measures, that surrender could become triumph when commanders were willing to sacrifice everything, including their reputations, for principles larger than personal honor or institutional approval.